Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about ZBrush and its relationship to scale because it's a little weird. So it's something that you may encounter. So in my Maya, I have basically blocked out a scene. I think it's roughly close to human scale. So I think, where's this? I'll bring this box in here. So I'll make this thing roughly human height, so 180 units. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little smaller than it should be, but that's okay. So I've already exported this scene as an OBJ. I've basically taken everything and exported it as a single object. So that's in here. Grave scene is what I've done. Now, to sort of let you know this, ZBrush, it's a little complicated when it comes to scale. By default, it actually works in centimeters. And if you go to Preferences, I believe it's under Transpose Units. You can go to Set Units. Now, right now, it's just a generic unit, but I believe 1 unit is equal to 1 centimeter. Now, you can click and set this to centimeters, but again, it's kind of redundant at this point. It's already, like I said, 1 generic unit is 1 centimeter. So, one other thing I should mention too, so whenever you sculpt something, when you build it in ZBrush, if you start from a standard sphere, which I often do, or maybe a cylinder or cube, these things are generally in a small scale, so 1 to 2 centimeters. So if you go to the Scale Transpose tool, so it's either Move, Rotate, or Scale, but in this case I'm using Scale as a way to check the size. It's actually almost like a yardstick or measuring stick. So I'm going to rotate to a side view by clicking and rotating and then holding Shift to snap, and then I'm going to go to the very bottom of the object as much as I can. Actually, I got to make sure I think this is in edit mode as well, so I'm going to click on Make Polymesh 3D. So make Polymesh 3D, and then I should be able to use the Scale tool to kind of click and drag out. So let me go, back to Scale, left click and drag. And I'm going to hold Shift again just so I make sure that this, this Transpose tool is pretty much parallel to the camera plane. And so we get a nice straight line through the object. Now if you notice, it'll tell you roughly in units, this thing is 2.151 units. In fact, it's really 2 centimeters or 2 units high. So this is kind of the scale ZBrush tends to prefer, and I'll show you why in a second. So if I go back to draw, right, you see I've got a draw size. If I hit S, it's roughly a standard draw size of 53, and if I scale this up, I can get to 1,000, right? So I can go around, I can sculpt. Actually, let me reset my brushes here. So I'll reset all brushes to get rid of that alpha. Alright, so I can kind of put a stroke through that. So that makes a difference. Now imagine if this thing were coming in from Maya, if I built it in a real world scale. So I'll quickly go to Deformation, go to Size, and scale this up once, twice, maybe 3 or 4 times. Okay, and then if I hit F to frame this, now look at my brush size relative to the object. I can't get larger than the object. I'm kind of limited to a certain brush size, right? And if I measure this out and go to Scale, again, making sure I'm in a side view, holding Shift and measuring this thing out roughly. So this thing is about 34 units, or 35 units, so roughly 35 centimeters. So that is a problem. You know, if you're bringing real world scale objects into ZBrush, it may not scale correctly or scale right. Now there are a couple of tools that allow us to kind of get around this issue. So if I hit S, you see there's a little dynamic switch. Okay, so the S is the draw size, or if you go up to the sort of top middle here where draw size is, you can try to turn on dynamic. This switch, by the way, is the worst because it's right next to the slider. It's kind of jammed in there. It's this tiny little label. And so it can be hard to see, hard to read, but I find it better to actually click it off and on while you're in the viewport. Again, I don't know, it doesn't always work great, but so one thing you can do if you get stuck with an object that's a large scale or a scene that's really large, make sure everything is one subtool and just take the size down. That's one technique I often use, and then if I bring it back to Maya or some of the 3D software, I'll just scale it back and use my blocking as a reference point, a guideline. Or there's a couple of tools we can try to use in ZBrush. We can go to Preferences, and if you look under Draw, we've actually got max draw size. So I can actually raise the maximum to 5,000 units. I'm not sure what those units are exactly. I think it's just a relative to the scale of the scene or the object. And then there's the dynamic brush scale. So dynamic, it tries to kind of keep the brush in proportion to the scale or size of the object. So when dynamic is on, it should scale the brush. If this object is super, super small, your slider should remain roughly consistent and track well with the size of that object if it's super tiny or super massive. The problem is, again, there's a scale multiplier. So we can try to max these two out if we have a huge scene. So that's one way around this size issue that can happen. So if you take a look now, right, my dynamic is on, so I don't even need to crank this up, right? And my draw size of 50 is roughly the same as it was when this thing was 5 times smaller, right? So that's kind of useful. And my max draw size now can go way out to 5,000, right? So that's one or two ways I'll do things, and sometimes I'll use a combination of both. If the scale is way off in ZBrush compared to other software, I'll play around a bit with the draw size, the max size, or the dynamic brush scale. Or I'll just take the whole scene or the whole object and size it up or down depending on what's kind of needed, okay? That's kind of a brief thing to touch upon. Now switch back, whenever importing objects into ZBrush, ZBrush can get a little weird. So if you've got an active sculpt in the tool palette and you go to import, it may think you want to swap the mesh and keep some of the sculpting detail, and it'll try to merge some things. That sometimes happens. So I usually just kind of switch to a generic object, one of these kind of pre-built objects like the cylinder, the sphere, the star, whatever. Okay, so I'll do that, and then I'll go to import. So I'll find my my layout. So I've got this thing, I've already exported the whole thing as one scene, so I'll go to open. Apparently I've got a couple mesh with some quads and triangles, so hopefully I can just say okay to that. Make it quads and triangles. So one thing I should mention too, sometimes when you're working, you want to often sculpt in perspective view, which is more organic and natural, and you can turn that off and on. So if you want an orthographic view on something so you can get a nice clean line or selection, that's really useful to be able to switch from orthographic to perspective. And right now I've got all these different objects. So what I can quickly do to organize my scene is go to Subtool and then go into Split, and I'll just say Split to Parts. You could actually do Split to Parts, which splits each and every separate mesh into a separate subtool. So each subtool will have its own separate subdivisions, or one part can be a dynamesh, another one can be a subdivision, and another one can be something else. What I often like to do is say split to similar parts, so the software will try to recognize mesh that is basically identical and keep them grouped together as a subtool. So I find that's often a smart way to go. So I'll click on split to similar parts, I'll say okay, it's giving me a warning it's undoable. So now you see the two blocks at the base of this thing, right? They're paired together. If you want to quickly switch subtools, it's simply Alt left click or Alt tablet pen tap on the part. So now this is its own subtool, right? This building. The roof is its own building, right? This is its own. These are paired together. So this is again really kind of quick and smart. Oh, what happened there? I think I lost the visibility of one of my tools. Anyways, I'll just move ahead. So one of the things I'll like to do, so I'll show you guys a couple of issues with ZBrush, especially when we're dealing with like man-made objects, something that needs to be squared. If you plan on dividing this thing, you can hit Control D, which is essentially the same as going into, so I'll close Subtool, go to Geometry, and it's basically the same thing as hitting Divide, Divide, right? But there's a huge problem there. It's just turning into this mess, right? So what we can basically do is go in, there's a function in here called smoothing. So this is basically like when you hit 3 on your keyboard. So if you hit divide, it's smoothing at the same time. So essentially that's like the smooth preview in Maya. But you can turn off smoothing and still divide. So if I turn this off and hit divide, all right, I'll hit Shift F, which is basically the polyframe button over to the side here. So hit Shift F to turn off the wireframe and Shift F to turn it back on, and now you can see there's more divisions, right, in the mesh. So I can do this dividing this way if I want to get more polys in for sculpting. So this way, this method works pretty well. Another method that I like, which I've been using a bit, is to crease. So what I can do is go to Crease and say Crease All. So basically this is a very simple object, and what it'll do, it's kind of like when I put extra loops into Mesh in Maya for smoothing. If I crease all, if you notice really closely there, you see what happens? It kind of adds a dotted line on either side of the original edges. So what happens now is even if I keep smoothing on and divide, it keeps those edges sharp. So Crease All works great in some of these situations. So that's kind of like option number 2, right? Crease All, and then we can divide. Option 3 is we can actually play around with doing this manually. So I can also uncrease all, by the way. So I can go back in here and do uncrease all. So this is one of the beautiful things I love about ZBrush. It's funny, the thing that I found intimidating about it at first is actually the thing that's ingenious about it, is that you can really be as limited as just kind of opening up a model, dividing it, and using a simple standard brush to sculpt almost everything. And you can slowly kind of learn what each of these little toolkits are. And each one is kind of like a self-contained set of functions. So it's almost like Crease does a lot of creasing. It can actually even bevel creased edges. There's some edge loop tools. There's clay polish, which does some smoothing and sharpening depending on what sliders you activate. Right, Dynamesh is its own tool, so instead of dividing to get more polys, you can use just Dynamesh and a resolution slider, which is good for more organic stuff. So that's kind of the genius part of ZBrush. Okay, so third way, I'll show you a third way to get more mesh or more loops in here. So if you wanted to kind of keep this in an organized fashion and just subdivide it, sometimes what I'll do as well, because I want to concentrate more polygons in the roof line rather than the front, because each poly gets divided the same amount, right? So this huge poly on top and on bottom will get the same amount of polys as the front sides, and that's kind of a waste of poly. So you'll get a ton of mesh in here, concentrated in here, but it'll be stretched out here. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll insert extra loops to put more polys into these areas. So one way to do that is to hit B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and Z modeler basically gives you a Maya style way of modeling inside of ZBrush. It's really ingenious. And if you notice, there's also like little letters across each of these brushes. So that's kind of a quick way to go from broad category, so B for all the brushes, Z for the name of the brush, and then I could go BZM to quickly jump to that brush if I don't have it mapped as a shortcut or as a link at the bottom of my interface. So I'll show you that, BZM, and then it'll jump to that brush. So what's interesting about this is that I can, if I hover over an edge, to activate the extended toolkit of this brush, you hit spacebar. So what this is basically I'm affecting edges or edge loops, and I can do, by default it's set to insert a loop. And so if I click and drag now, I can quickly drop in loops across the mesh, right? So it's really useful. If you're hovering over a polygon and you hit spacebar, you get different types of edits for that. So the first section is for edits. So this would be extrusions, right, on polygons, flipping faces, deleting, creasing, bridging, all that sort of stuff, right? Then you can say, do you want to affect a single polygon, all polygons, all quads? So there's a bunch of ways you can sort of say affect a selection. So let's say I go poly loop, and I'm going to extrude. So again, if you switch functions, it may switch the selection type. So I'll go extrude, and I'll do a poly loop. And you can say one-sided, no sides. Again, there's a bunch of modifiers on top of that at the end. So what will happen here is if I left-click, I'll extrude out this way. But if I click towards the other angle, I'll extrude the other way. It's really amazing, really ingenious. Love ZBrush for so many reasons. And the same thing, so let's say we go to vertex. I'm going to just undo those loops I put in. Let's say I hover over vertex and hit spacebar. Now I've got basically move options. If you want to keep the overall shape, so this is like in Maya when we have an edge slide or surface slide constraint. You can do a slide, so it tries to keep the overall shape, and we can slide, or we can split, or we can extrude. So I'll just maybe try and extrude. So extruding a point, so it's actually pulling a new point up from that one initial point, right, or vertex. So this tool, like I said, really powerful, really awesome, and it gives you a lot of Maya-style functionality inside of ZBrush. So I'll go back to Edge, Insert, and I'll try maybe multiple loops. When you do multiple loops, it actually tries to maintain equalized spacing. So you can see it's equally allowing me to drop in loops as I go. And then I'll go across this way, let's say, right? So that's really amazingly powerful. So this is another way to kind of help add some structure. But again, if I divide this with smoothing on, it's still going to wash out. So in a case like this, what I might do is now kind of combine. So this is case number 3, where I've added some extra loops to concentrate things, but I still need to keep some creasing. So I'm going to use another method that I like, which is to actually organize the mesh into polygroups. So I'm going to just hit solo mode for a second. Now, I've talked about polygroups before, but basically what polygroups are, so when I hit Shift F, right, to turn this off or on, Shift F enables both a kind of color coding on the mesh and a wireframe. Most objects, when they come into ZBrush, they just have kind of one polygroup, or they haven't had polygroups created for it yet. So in order to do that, we can do this one of a couple ways. Sometimes we can, I'll switch to a standard brush here. Let's say I mask an area, and if I hit Control W, whatever is mostly masked will be converted into a new polygroup. So I can also do this based on visibility. So by default, there's this tool called the Select Rectangle tool. So when you hold Control Shift, it's actually activating that brush or that tool. So when you Control Shift, click and drag over a section, you're only going to make one part visible. With that one part visible, I can say Control W, which makes a new polygroup. And if I Control Shift, click off, now I've got 2 groups, right? So I can crease. So again, combining the idea of polygroups and organizing, I can actually crease by polygroup. So crease PG. So I can determine exactly where I want the creasing to be, because watch this. If I go Crease All right now, every single edge gets creased, right? And I don't necessarily want that. I want to crease by polygroup. Now, I've mentioned this many times before. I'm lazy. I don't want to necessarily go to each side and crease or make a new polygroup. So in polygroups, again, this is going back to the genius of ZBrush. I know all this stuff looks intimidating, but when you break it down, like each tool is a very simple tool with a couple of extended options, right? So I can actually polygroup by UVs. So if I import a mesh and all those UV islands that I have, I can actually create polygroups based on UVs by going auto group with UV. In this case, I just want to do it based on angle. So anything over 45 degrees will be a new group. Anything under 45 degrees will be maintained within one group. So if I click Group by Normals, it auto groups all the sides, right? Front, back, top, and bottom, right? So now if I go back, I may actually need to split this in half as well. So I'll do this, and yeah, let me just isolate these guys as well. So I'll hit Control W, just so there's a new group. Sometimes the color coding, by the way, looks identical, but this is slightly different from this. So this is still technically a separate polygroup. So now if I go back, I may have to do the same thing with the sort of front and end caps here. So I'll just hit Control W with that isolated. So now that's a polygroup. It should be, yeah, there we go. So I'll do the same thing at the back side, because I do need to crease along that kind of center line, right? So let's Control Shift, click on this end piece. Control Shift Alt, by the way, this is like masking. So when you Control click and drag, it creates a mask. When you Control Alt click and drag, it removes from a mask. So this is the same thing with visibility. If you Control Shift click and drag, it will make these parts visible within the green, or if you want to hide those parts, you hold Alt. That's kind of the subtraction mode, basically, whether it's masking, visibility, or even in brushing, right? So if you brush with a brush, it flips it from an add to a subtract, or from a subtract to an add. Okay, so that's done. I've basically got, I hope, enough areas there, so I can go to Geometry, Crease Polygroup, right? So now I've got creasing all along the edges I want. And now I can divide. Divide a couple of times. So I'll just do a really quick brush example here. So I'm going to divide this a bunch. So let's just close crease, divide. Usually, as I mentioned earlier today, I need to hit 1,000,000 polys or so. So I'm going to hit about 1,000,000 polys. And as I mentioned earlier today, we can load up, right, an alpha and switch to a drag type and drag out a pattern for the roof, right? Now this is really sort of sloppy and messy, so the other thing I can do as well, because of these polygroups, this is one of the amazing things about polygroups. I'm going to Control Shift Alt click on the parts I don't want to be visible. So I'm going to hide basically the polygroups I don't want to see right now. I really want to focus on the top of the roof. So I'll kind of go around here and isolate these parts. Okay, so let's isolate the sides. Hopefully without accidentally isolating the, yeah, there we go. By the way, when you've got mesh like this, you typically can only see the front side of the mesh, not the inside or back side of the mesh. To change that, you can simply go down to the bottom on the right-hand side of the tool palette, go to Display Properties, and say double-sided. So now you can view inside and out. So I can, I see this thing. So I think when I polygrouped it, right, I didn't polygroup that separately. So let me just see if I can quickly just hide this off. Okay. There. Almost done. Okay. Oh, sorry. Just saw one little bit of mesh still sticking out there. Okay. So that is now visible. So I can drag this out. I may actually, in fact, just load the brush instead. So let me go back to my brushes here. So again, S drive. Actually, here, let me just go S drive in here. And I'll load up one of my XMD brushes. So let's see. Yeah, there's architectural brushes too. So there's like pebbles, there's rocks, there's stucco. Maybe I'll try stucco. So this is just going to load. Yeah, let's turn off this wireframe for a second. So stucco is kind of like just this rough texture, right? So I can kind of just throw a stucco on that if I want. Again, I usually will try to go down in intensity with this stuff. Do a quick pass. And then I can unhide the rest. Now, if you're doing something that's just a base texture like this, I will probably have a tendency to do it just evenly across the whole surface. One of the problems, though, you have to watch out for is you got to watch out because this is all projection based, meaning that the angle at which you're facing the object and the angle at which you're brushing, it could streak and stretch across surfaces that are starting to turn away from the camera that are not parallel to the camera. So oftentimes I will isolate based on polygroups. And the backside I may not worry about as much. You know, maybe there's a bit of stuff from the overhang. Another issue you have to watch out for is that if you're brushing, so let me undo a lot of this and I'll show you guys another issue. So if you drag across, oops, let me unhide all this mesh again. So if we drag across, it may actually go through to the backside. So what happens is when you have mesh that folds over itself and is really thin, sometimes you can get stuff that projects from the front side of the model to the back side. So I've actually laid out a custom button here called Back Face Mask. So you can turn this option on. If you don't have the custom interface, you can go to Brush. It's in Brush under, I believe, Auto Masking, and there's a button in there called Back Face Mask. Okay, so Auto Masking, Back Face Mask. It's the same button, just I've got a duplicate in my interface. So now if I undo and try this again, right, it'll only work on that front side face, okay? So again, really, really useful. So whether you're putting down kind of a more rough, even texture, by the way, let me redo this. You see what happened here on the sides, right? I think I hit this from a glancing angle, or that face was facing away. So, you know, it's often useful to hide some of your polygroups while doing some of this kind of painting, and then, you know, maybe fix it up a little bit later. By the way, the same thing is true. So with masking too, let's say I try to mask this, and sometimes you've seen this. If I mask the top side of something, it actually masks through the back. If you want to avoid that as well, when you're holding control, this is, again, it's activating another brush, which is the mask pen brush. So while you hold control down, you have to also tell it to have back face masking. This button is a per brush option. So every time you switch brushes, if you're going through, you have to go back and check that option. Okay, so when I mask now, it's funny, sometimes it still masks through even with back face masking on, but in this case it's actually working correctly. So Anyways, that's a bit of I guess, a crash course on setting up your scenes, right? And as I said, we can use alphas to drag out patterns. Let me undo this again, and I'll drag out an alpha. And if we want repeating, there's a couple ways to repeat. We can basically go into the curve mode under brush curve mode, and increase or turn on wrap mode, so we can get some kind of repetition. And you want to make sure that you get enough repetition so that you don't have to scale up or down your tile too high. This is one issue that I see a lot. People use the wrong scale of texture sometimes, or the wrong scale of alpha on their objects. And repetition is also kind of ugly as well. If you got a really even pattern, so you might have to get different texture samples or different alphas to mix up your scene and match it up a little bit. Okay.